Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he hammered the last nail into the fence post. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in every direction, with nothing but sagebrush and rocky hills breaking the horizon. He had bought this remote piece of land 6 months ago, drawn by the promise of solitude and the chance to build something with his own hands. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and that was exactly how he liked it. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when he first saw her. She appeared like a mirage at first, walking slowly along the dirt road that led to his property. Marcus set down his hammer and shielded his eyes against the glare. As she drew closer, he could make out her features more clearly. She was Native American, probably in her early 20s, with long black hair that caught the light like silk. Her clothes were simple but clean, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that immediately caught his attention. She stopped at his gate, which was really just 2 posts with a chain between them. Marcus had never bothered to put up a real gate since he rarely had visitors. He walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice friendly but cautious. Living alone in the desert had taught him to be careful with strangers. The young woman looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My car broke down about 2 miles back on the main road. My phone has no signal out here. I was wondering if I could use yours to call for help." Marcus glanced in the direction she had come from. He couldn't see any broken-down vehicle, but the road curved behind a hill. It would make sense that he couldn't spot it from here. He looked back at her, noting the exhaustion in her posture and the dust on her shoes. "Of course," he said, unhooking the chain. "Come on up to the house. I've got a landline that should work." As they walked up the gravel path to his modest cabin, Marcus found himself stealing glances at his unexpected visitor. There was something about her that seemed familiar, though he was certain they had never met. Perhaps it was the way she moved, with a grace that suggested she was completely at home in this harsh landscape. While he still felt like an outsider after 6 months. "I'm Marcus. By the way," he said as they reached his front porch. "Ayanna," she replied, and the name seemed to fit her perfectly. The cabin was simple but comfortable. Marcus had built most of it himself, using salvaged materials and a lot of determination. It wasn't much to look at, but it was his. He gestured toward the phone on the kitchen counter. "Help yourself," he said. "I'll get you some water. You look like you could use it." While Ayanna made her call, Marcus busied himself in the kitchen, filling a glass with cold water from his well. He couldn't help but overhear parts of her conversation, though she spoke quietly. She seemed to be talking to someone about a tow truck, giving directions to her location. What struck him was that she spoke in 2 languages, switching between English and what he assumed was her native language with fluid ease. When she finished the call, she turned to him with a grateful smile. "Thank you so much. The tow truck should be here in about an hour." Marcus handed her the glass of water, which she accepted gratefully. "An hour, huh? Well, you're welcome to wait here. It'll be getting dark soon, and I don't like the idea of you walking back to your car alone." Ayanna studied his face for a moment, as if trying to read his intentions. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded. "That's very kind of you. I promise I won't be any trouble." "No trouble at all," Marcus assured her. "Actually, it's nice to have some company. I don't get many visitors out here." They sat on his front porch as the sun continued its descent. Marcus learned that Ayanna lived on the reservation about 30 miles east, where she worked as a teacher at the local school. She had been visiting a friend in town when her car started making strange noises and finally gave up completely. "What brought you out here?" she asked, gesturing at the vast emptiness surrounding them. "It's pretty isolated." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. "I needed a fresh start," he said finally. "I was in the military for 8 years, did 3 tours overseas. When I came back, I couldn't seem to settle into civilian life. The cities felt too crowded, too noisy. I wanted somewhere I could think clearly." Ayanna nodded as if she understood completely. "The desert has a way of healing people," she said. "My grandmother always said that the land here holds ancient wisdom. She believed it could teach patience to those willing to listen." There was something in the way she said it that made Marcus look at her more closely. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Ayanna said, and there was a note of sadness in her voice. "She passed away 2 years ago. She used to tell the most amazing stories about this area. According to her, this whole region was sacred to our people long before any settlers arrived." Marcus felt a slight chill despite the warm evening air. Sacred how? Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her eyes scanning the horizon. She said these hills and valleys were where warriors came to seek visions, where important ceremonies were held. There are places out here that have been holy ground for hundreds of years. As if summoned by her words, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else Marcus couldn't identify. In the distance he could hear the lonely call of a coyote, soon answered by another and then another. "Do you believe in those stories?" Marcus asked. Ayanna turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. "I believe that some places hold memories," she said, "and that those memories don't just disappear because time passes or because new people arrive." Just then, they heard the rumble of a truck engine in the distance. Ayanna stood up, brushing dust from her clothes. "That must be the tow truck," she said. As they walked back down to the road, Marcus found himself reluctant to see her go. There had been something almost magical about their conversation, a connection he hadn't felt with anyone in a long time. The tow truck driver was a gruff man who barely acknowledged Marcus. As he loaded Ayanna's car onto his truck, she turned back to Marcus. "Thank you again for everything," she said. "You're very kind. Will you be okay getting home?" Marcus asked. "My cousin is meeting me at the garage," she assured him. "I'll be fine." As the tow truck disappeared into the gathering darkness, Marcus stood alone in his driveway watching the taillights fade. Something about the evening felt unfinished, as if their meeting had been the beginning of something rather than a simple chance encounter. He didn't know it yet, but Ayanna had not told him everything. Her car hadn't broken down by accident, and her visit to his property wasn't as random as it seemed. In the shadows of the hills around his home, other eyes had been watching and plans had been set in motion that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about his quiet desert refuge. 3 days passed before Marcus saw Ayanna again. He found himself thinking about her more often than he cared to admit, replaying their conversation on the porch and wondering if he would ever see her again. The desert felt lonelier than usual, and even his daily routines of building and maintaining his homestead couldn't quite shake the feeling that something important had walked out of his life along with that tow truck. On Thursday morning, as he was checking his water pump behind the house, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. His heart jumped with the hope that it might be Ayanna, but when he walked around to the front, he found a dusty pickup truck parked in his driveway. A man about his own age sat behind the wheel, and in the passenger seat was Ayanna. Marcus felt a smile spread across his face as he approached the truck. Ayanna stepped out looking even more beautiful than he remembered. She wore jeans and a simple blue shirt, and her hair was braided down her back. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced," she said, though her own smile suggested she wasn't too worried about it. "Not at all," Marcus replied, meaning it completely. "I'm glad to see you made it home safely the other night." The driver got out of the truck and walked around to join them. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His dark hair was shorter than Ayanna's, and his eyes held a careful assessment of Marcus that made him feel like he was being quietly evaluated. "Marcus, this is my brother Jake," Ayanna said. "Jake, this is the kind man who helped me the other night." Jake extended his hand and Marcus shook it, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of hard work. "Appreciate you looking out for my sister," Jake said, his voice neutral but not unfriendly. "Anyone would have done the same," Marcus replied, though he had the feeling that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have invited a stranger into their home, especially out here where help was far away if things went wrong. "We brought you something," Ayanna said, reaching into the truck and pulling out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "It's not much, just some bread my aunt made and some honey from our neighbor's bees. A small thank you for your kindness." Marcus accepted the bundle, touched by the gesture. "You really didn't need to do this, but thank you. Would you like to come in for some coffee? I was just about to take a break anyway." Jake glanced at Ayanna and Marcus caught some unspoken communication pass between them. "We don't want to impose," Jake said. "You're not imposing," Marcus assured them. "I was serious about not getting much company out here. It's nice to have people to talk to." This time it was Ayanna who made the decision. "Coffee sounds wonderful," she said, and Jake nodded his agreement. As they walked toward the house, Marcus noticed how both siblings moved with that same natural grace he had observed in Ayanna. They seemed to belong to this landscape in a way that he was still trying to achieve. Jake's eyes were constantly moving, taking in details of Marcus's property, the improvements he had made, the way he had positioned his solar panels and water collection system. "You've done good work here," Jake commented as they climbed the porch steps. "This land can be challenging for people who aren't used to it." "I'm still learning," Marcus admitted. "Trial and error, mostly. The internet can only teach you so much about desert living." Inside, as Marcus prepared coffee, Ayanna and Jake looked around his modest home with what seemed like genuine interest rather than judgment. Marcus had worried that his simple furnishings and bare-bones lifestyle might seem primitive, but neither of them appeared to find anything lacking. "You built most of this yourself?" Jake asked, running his hand along a wooden beam that Marcus had salvaged from an old barn. "Yeah, with help from YouTube and a lot of stubbornness," Marcus said, earning a laugh from Ayanna. "It's not fancy, but it's solid." "Fancy doesn't last long out here," Jake observed. "Solid is what matters." As they sat around Marcus's small kitchen table with their coffee, the conversation flowed more easily than Marcus had expected. Jake was quieter than his sister, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. He worked construction on the reservation and had his own small ranch where he raised horses. Ayanna talked about her students and the challenges of teaching in a school that was always short on resources, but rich in community spirit. "The kids are amazing," she said, her face lighting up as she spoke. "They're so connected to their heritage, but they're also curious about the world beyond the reservation. Finding ways to honor both parts of their identity can be tricky, but it's important work." Marcus found himself genuinely interested in their lives, their community, their connection to this land that he was just beginning to understand. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but the other night you mentioned your grandmother's stories about this area being sacred. Are there specific places around here that are particularly important?" Again, he caught that silent communication between the siblings. This time it was Jake who answered. "There are places throughout this region that have been important to our people for generations," he said carefully. "Some are burial grounds, some are ceremonial sites, some are just places where the spirits are particularly strong. Most people don't know about them, and we prefer to keep it that way." "Of course," Marcus said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry. I just find the history fascinating. Back where I grew up in Ohio, the oldest thing around was a farmhouse from the 1800s. The idea that there are places here that have been sacred for hundreds of years is incredible to me." Ayanna leaned forward slightly. "What made you choose this particular piece of land?" she asked. "There are other remote areas that might have been easier to develop." Marcus thought about it. "Honestly, the moment I stood on this spot, it felt right. I know that sounds strange, but there was something about this place that just called to me. Like I was supposed to be here." Jake and Ayanna exchanged another look, this one longer and more meaningful than the others. Marcus was beginning to realize that these silent conversations were a regular part of their communication, probably developed over years of being close siblings. "Sometimes the land chooses the people as much as people choose the land," Ayanna said softly. They stayed for another hour, and by the time they prepared to leave, Marcus felt like he had made real friends rather than just polite acquaintances. Jake's initial wariness had faded, replaced by something that might have been respect. Ayanna seemed genuinely pleased that they had come. "If you ever need anything," Jake said as they stood by his truck, "or if you have questions about living out here, don't hesitate to ask. Neighbors should look out for each other, especially in country like this." "I appreciate that," Marcus said, "and the same goes for you. If there's ever anything I can do to help, just let me know." As they drove away, Marcus waved from his porch, feeling better than he had in days. He had no way of knowing that this visit, like Ayanna's first appearance at his gate, had been carefully planned. The siblings had learned what they needed to know about him, and decisions were being made in places he had never seen by people he had never met. In the hills surrounding his property, patient eyes continued their watch, and ancient protocols were being followed that would soon bring Marcus face to face with truths he never could have imagined. The dream started 2 weeks after Jake and Ayanna's visit. At first, Marcus dismissed them as nothing more than his subconscious processing the new friendships and the stories Ayanna had shared about her grandmother. But as the dreams became more frequent and more vivid, he found it harder to explain them away. They always began the same way. Marcus would find himself standing in his backyard in the pre-dawn darkness. Though he had no memory of walking outside, the desert stretched before him. bathed in silver moonlight that made every rock and shrub appear to glow with an inner light. In the dreams, he could hear voices carried on the wind, speaking in a language he didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. The voices seemed to be calling him toward the hills that rose behind his property. In his waking hours, those hills looked ordinary enough, covered with scrub brush and scattered boulders. But in the dreams, they seemed to pulse with life, as if something ancient and powerful dwelt within their rocky embrace. Marcus would begin walking toward the hills, his bare feet somehow finding sure footing on ground that should have been treacherous in the darkness. As he climbed, the voices grew stronger, more insistent. Sometimes he thought he could almost make out words, almost understand what they were trying to tell him. But just as comprehension seemed within reach, he would wake up in his own bed, heart pounding and covered in sweat. The dreams were so real that on more than one occasion, Marcus had gotten up to check if his feet were dirty or if he had somehow actually been walking in his sleep. But his feet were always clean, his door always locked, and there was never any evidence that he had left his bed during the night. Still, the dreams left him unsettled. During his third week of strange night visions, he found himself paying more attention to those hills during his daily work. Several times he thought he saw movement among the rocks and shadows, fleeting glimpses that could have been animals or tricks of the light. Once, while repairing his solar panel array, he was certain he saw the silhouette of a person standing on a ridge about half a mile away. But when he looked again, nothing was there. Marcus began to wonder if the isolation was getting to him more than he had realized. He had always been comfortable with solitude, but perhaps months of seeing almost no one except for his occasional trips to town were taking a toll on his mental state. He considered calling Jake or Ayanna, but what would he say? That he was having weird dreams and thought he was seeing people who weren't there. They would think he was losing his mind. On a Thursday morning in late October, as Marcus was fixing a leak in his irrigation system, he heard the sound of horses approaching. He looked up to see 3 riders coming across the desert from the direction of the reservation. As they drew closer, he recognized Jake in the lead, followed by 2 older men he had never seen before. All 3 men rode with the easy confidence of people who had been in the saddle since childhood. Their horses moved smoothly across the rough terrain, picking their way between rocks and bushes with barely any guidance from their riders. Marcus stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and walked out to meet them. "Morning, Jake," he called out as the riders approached. "This is a nice surprise." Jake dismounted and shook Marcus's hand, but there was something different about his demeanor today. He seemed more formal, more serious than he had during his previous visit. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet my Uncle Thomas and my grandfather Samuel," Jake said, gesturing to the 2 older men who had also dismounted. Thomas appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors. Samuel was clearly the eldest of the group, probably in his 70s, but he sat straight in the saddle and moved with the vitality of a much younger man. Both men studied Marcus with intense, measuring gazes. "It's an honor to meet you both," Marcus said, extending his hand to each man in turn. Samuel's handshake was firm and lingering, and Marcus had the strange feeling that the old man was reading something in his grip, some message that Marcus wasn't even aware he was sending. "We've heard about you from Jake and Ayanna," Thomas said, his voice deep and measured. "We wanted to meet the man who has chosen to make his home in this place." Something in the way he said "this place" made Marcus's skin prickle with awareness. "I hope they've said good things," he replied, trying to keep the conversation light. Samuel spoke for the first time, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere age. "They have told us that you are a man of honor, someone who showed kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return. These are good qualities, and thank you, sir. That means a lot, especially coming from you." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Marcus was reminded of the silent communication he had observed between Jake and Ayanna. It was clear that some decision was being made, some protocol being followed that he didn't understand. "We would like to speak with you about something important," Thomas said. "May we sit somewhere and talk?" Marcus led them to his porch, where they settled into the chairs he had built from salvaged lumber. The horses stood patiently in his yard, occasionally snorting or stamping, but showing no inclination to wander. Samuel leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on Marcus's face. "Tell me about your dreams," he said simply. The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stared at the old man, his mouth opening and closing without any words coming out. How could Samuel possibly know about the dreams? I can see from your reaction that you have been having them, Samuel continued. The land has been calling to you, has it not? You hear voices in the darkness, voices that speak in the old language. You feel drawn to the sacred places even though you do not understand why. Marcus found his voice at last. How did you know? I haven't told anyone about the dreams. Because the land tells us when someone new arrives who has the sensitivity to hear its voice, Thomas explained. It doesn't happen often with outsiders, but when it does, we pay attention. Jake leaned back in his chair and Marcus could see something like sympathy in his expression. We've been watching you since you first arrived here, Marcus. Not spying exactly, but keeping an eye on things. This area is important to our people, and we needed to know what kind of person you were. The place where you have built your home, Samuel said, sits at the edge of what we call the listening grounds. For hundreds of years, our young warriors came here to seek visions, to listen for guidance from the spirits of our ancestors. It is a place where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world is thin. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying I'm trespassing on sacred ground? Because if I am, I'll leave. I never meant any disrespect. Samuel held up a weathered hand. No, young man. If you were meant to leave, the land would have driven you away by now. Desert country has many ways of rejecting those who don't belong. Instead, it has been calling to you, trying to teach you something. Teach me what? Thomas answered this time. That remains to be seen. But the dreams you've been having are not random. They are invitations. The spirits of this place want to show you something, to share something with you. The question is whether you are brave enough to accept their invitation. Marcus looked from one face to another, seeing nothing but sincerity and ancient wisdom. What exactly are you asking me to do? Samuel smiled for the first time since his arrival, and the expression transformed his stern features. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, we will come for you. We will take you to the place where the voices originate, where you can learn what the spirits want you to know. But I must warn you, once you cross that threshold, your life will never be the same. You will see things that most people in your world would not believe, and you will become part of something much larger than yourself. Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest. Every rational part of his mind was screaming that this was impossible, that he was being drawn into something he couldn't understand. But another part of him, a deeper part that seemed to recognize the truth in Samuel's words, was already nodding in agreement. Will I be in danger? He asked. All growth involves danger, Samuel replied. But we believe you are being called for a reason. The spirits do not waste their time on those who cannot handle what they have to offer. As the three men prepared to leave, mounting their horses with fluid grace, Samuel turned back to Marcus one final time. Prepare yourself tomorrow by fasting and spending time in quiet reflection. Wear simple clothes and bring nothing with you except an open mind and a willing heart. We will come for you when the sun sets. Marcus stood in his yard long after the riders had disappeared into the desert, watching the dust settle and trying to process what had just happened. Tomorrow night he would discover truths about his new home that he never could have imagined, and his understanding of reality itself would be forever changed. Marcus spent the next day in a state of nervous anticipation mixed with growing doubt. As the hours passed, the rational part of his mind began to assert itself more strongly. What was he thinking? Agreeing to follow three strangers into the desert in the middle of the night. He had been in the military, trained to assess threats and make smart tactical decisions. Everything about this situation should have triggered his caution. But every time he considered backing out, he remembered the look in Samuel's eyes, the absolute certainty in the old man's voice when he spoke about the spirits calling to Marcus. There had been something in that conversation that felt more real than anything Marcus had experienced in months. He followed Samuel's instructions, eating nothing all day and spending his time in quiet thought. As the afternoon wore on, he found himself drawn repeatedly to his back window, gazing out at the hills where his dreams had always led him. In the bright daylight, they looked ordinary again, just rocky outcroppings covered with desert vegetation, but he could swear he felt something from them, a subtle energy that seemed to pulse with his own heartbeat. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus changed into simple jeans and a plain cotton shirt. He left his watch on the nightstand and his wallet in the drawer. Whatever was about to happen, Samuel had been clear that he should bring nothing from his ordinary world. The riders appeared just as the last light faded from the western sky. This time there were 5 of them, and Marcus recognized Jake and Samuel among the group. The others were men he had never seen before, ranging in age from perhaps 30 to 60. All of them had the same quiet dignity and natural grace that he had come to associate with Ayanna's family. "Are you ready?" Samuel asked as Marcus approached the group. "As ready as I can be for something I don't understand," Marcus replied honestly. One of the younger men held the reins of a saddled horse, a calm-looking mare with intelligent eyes. "This is Luna," Jake said. "She'll take good care of you. She's been on this path many times before." Marcus had some experience with horses from his childhood, though it had been years since he had ridden. Luna stood patiently as he mounted, and he was grateful for her steady temperament as he found his seat in the saddle. The group rode in single file, with Samuel leading and Marcus positioned in the middle of the group. They moved slowly across the desert, following what appeared to be an ancient trail that Marcus had never noticed before. In the darkness, lit only by starlight, the landscape took on an otherworldly quality. Familiar landmarks became strange and mysterious, and Marcus found himself in a place that seemed both like home and completely alien. They rode for perhaps an hour, climbing gradually into the hills behind Marcus's property. The only sounds were the soft footfalls of the horses and the occasional call of a night bird. No one spoke, and Marcus sensed that this silence was intentional, a way of preparing for whatever lay ahead. Finally, Samuel raised his hand, and the group came to a halt. They were in a natural amphitheater formed by towering rock walls, with a flat area in the center that was perhaps 50 feet across. Even in the darkness, Marcus could feel that this place was different. The air seemed thicker here, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. The men dismounted and led their horses to one side of the clearing, where they tied them to a sturdy shrub. Samuel approached Marcus carrying what looked like a small clay pot with smoke rising from it. "This is sage," Samuel explained, using his hand to waft the smoke toward Marcus. "It purifies the spirit and opens the mind to things that cannot be seen with ordinary vision." The smoke had a clean, sharp scent that seemed to clear Marcus's head rather than cloud it. As Samuel continued the smudging ritual, moving the smoke around Marcus's body, the younger man felt a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. "Sit here," Samuel said, indicating a flat rock near the center of the clearing. "Face the eastern wall and open your mind to whatever comes." Marcus settled onto the rock, which was still warm from absorbing the day's heat. The other men arranged themselves in a circle around the clearing, but far enough away that Marcus felt alone with whatever was about to happen. For several minutes, nothing occurred except the gradual deepening of the silence. Marcus found his breathing slowing, his heartbeat becoming more noticeable in the quiet. The rock walls around him seemed to grow taller and more imposing, as if they were leaning in to observe him. Then he began to hear the voices. They started as a whisper so faint that he thought it might be the wind moving through the rocks. But gradually, the whispers grew stronger and more distinct, though he still couldn't understand the words. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the ground beneath him, from the very air around him. Marcus felt no fear, only a growing sense of wonder. This was what he had been hearing in his dreams, but now it was stronger, clearer, more purposeful. The voices weren't random sounds. They were trying to communicate something specific. As he continued to listen, images began forming in his mind. He saw the clearing as it had been hundreds of years ago, filled with young Apache warriors seeking visions and guidance. He watched as generation after generation came to this place, each adding their prayers and hopes to the spiritual energy that accumulated here like water in a deep well. The visions shifted, and Marcus saw the arrival of the first European settlers, the conflicts that followed, the forced relocations and the breaking of treaties. He felt the pain and anger of a proud people driven from their ancestral lands, but also their determination to preserve their culture and their connection to the sacred places. Then the images focused on more recent times, and Marcus saw his own arrival in the desert. But now he understood that his choice of that particular piece of land had not been random. He had been drawn there by the same forces that were speaking to him now, guided by spirits who had been waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between worlds. The voices grew stronger, and suddenly Marcus could understand them. They spoke of a responsibility that came with his presence in this sacred place, a role as guardian and protector that he had never asked for but that had chosen him nonetheless. You have been called to stand watch over the listening grounds, the voices told him, to ensure that this place remains protected for future generations. The old ways and the new ways must learn to coexist, and you will be part of that bridge. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, though he hadn't been aware of crying. The weight of what was being asked of him was enormous, but so was the honor. These people, who had every reason to distrust outsiders, were inviting him to become part of something sacred and ancient. The visions began to fade, and the voices grew quiet once more. Marcus sat in the silence for a long time, processing what he had experienced. When he finally looked around, he saw that Samuel was sitting nearby, watching him with knowing eyes. "What did they tell you?" the old man asked, gently. Marcus tried to find words for the experience, but everything seemed inadequate. "They said I've been called to be a guardian, to help protect this place, but I don't understand how I'm supposed to do that." Samuel nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "The spirits rarely give complete instructions all at once," he said. "Your understanding will grow over time, as you learn to listen more deeply and as situations arise that require your involvement." The other men began to approach, and Marcus could see approval and acceptance in their faces. Whatever test he had just undergone, he seemed to have passed it. "Welcome to the family," Jake said, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're not just our neighbor anymore. You're our brother, bound to us and to this land by ties that go deeper than blood." As they prepared to ride back, Marcus felt fundamentally changed. The man who had climbed into these hills was not the same person who would be riding home. He had been given a glimpse of a reality that most people never suspected existed, and he had been entrusted with responsibilities that would shape the rest of his life. But even as he accepted this new role, Marcus had no idea how soon he would be called upon to fulfill it, or how dramatically his quiet desert existence was about to be transformed. 3 weeks passed after the ceremony in the hills, and Marcus found himself settling into his new role in ways he hadn't expected. Samuel visited twice, bringing with him teachings about the land and its spiritual significance that Marcus absorbed like a student hungry for knowledge. Ayanna came by more frequently, sometimes alone and sometimes with other family members who wanted to meet the white man who had been accepted by the spirits. Through these visits, Marcus learned that his property sat at the center of a network of sacred sites that extended for miles in every direction. His home was not just a house in the desert. It was a watchtower positioned to guard approaches to some of the most holy places in Apache tradition. The responsibility felt overwhelming at times, but also strangely natural, as if he had been preparing for this role his entire life without knowing it. The dreams had changed after the ceremony. Instead of the confused, wandering, and incomprehensible voices, Marcus now experienced clear visions that came with purpose and meaning. He saw the movement of animals across the desert, the patterns of weather approaching from distant mountains, and sometimes, most importantly, the presence of people who didn't belong in these sacred spaces. It was on a cold November morning that the first real test of his new role arrived. Marcus was splitting firewood behind his house when he felt a familiar tingling sensation, the same energy he had learned to associate with spiritual communication. He set down his axe and closed his eyes, allowing the vision to form in his mind. He saw vehicles approaching from the south, 3 large trucks filled with men carrying metal detectors and digging equipment. They were treasure hunters, drawn by internet rumors about ancient Apache gold supposedly hidden in these hills. Marcus had heard similar stories in town, modern myths that attracted people who saw the desert only as a place to exploit, rather than respect. The vision showed him exactly where the men were headed, a canyon about 2 miles from his property that contained petroglyphs and burial sites that were over 1,000 years old. If these treasure hunters reached their destination, they would desecrate ground that was sacred beyond measure, destroying irreplaceable artifacts and disturbing the spirits of the ancient dead. Marcus opened his eyes and immediately reached for his satellite phone. Samuel had given him a special number to call if situations like this arose. The old man answered on the second ring as if he had been waiting for the call. "They're coming," Marcus said without preamble. 3 trucks, maybe a dozen men with metal detectors. "They're heading for the canyon with the rock paintings. How long do we have?" Samuel's voice was calm but urgent. Marcus closed his eyes again, checking the vision. "Maybe an hour, depending on how much trouble they have with the rough roads." "We'll be there in 20 minutes, Samuel said. "Can you delay them if they arrive before we do?" Marcus looked at his rifle rack, then at the heavy pistol he kept for protection against dangerous wildlife. I can try, but I'd rather not have to use force if we can avoid it. Force should be the last option, Samuel agreed. But do not let them reach the sacred places. Too much depends on keeping those sites protected. After hanging up, Marcus quickly gathered supplies he might need. He filled a thermos with coffee, grabbed some energy bars, and checked his first aid kit. If this was going to be a confrontation, he wanted to be prepared for various outcomes. He drove his pickup truck to a spot where the rough desert track narrowed between two large boulders, creating a natural checkpoint that would be difficult to bypass. From here, he could see for miles in the direction the treasure hunters would be coming from, and anyone trying to reach the canyon would have to go through this bottleneck. Marcus positioned his truck across the track and settled in to wait. The November air was crisp and clear, and he could hear the distant call of hawks riding the thermals above the desert floor. In different circumstances, it would have been a peaceful morning to spend outdoors. 20 minutes later, as promised, he heard the sound of horses approaching from the north. Samuel appeared first, followed by Jake and 4 other men Marcus recognized from the ceremony. They rode with the quiet efficiency of people who had handled situations like this before, spreading out to positions that would give them good vantage points while remaining hidden from anyone approaching on the road. "Any sign of them yet?" Samuel asked as he dismounted near Marcus's truck. "Not yet, but they should be here soon," Marcus replied. "What's the plan?" "We talk first," Samuel said. "Most of these treasure hunters are just ignorant, not malicious. Sometimes they can be reasoned with, but if they refuse to listen..." He gestured to the other men who Marcus noticed were all carrying rifles in addition to their traditional weapons. "I'd rather handle this peacefully if possible," Marcus said. "Violence tends to create more problems than it solves." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a true guardian. We will try words first, but understand that some things are worth fighting for, and these sacred places are among them." They didn't have to wait long. The sound of diesel engines struggling with the rough terrain announced the arrival of the treasure hunters well before they came into view. When the 3 trucks finally appeared, bouncing and lurching over the rocky track, Marcus was struck by how out of place they looked in this ancient landscape. The lead truck came to a stop about 50 yards from Marcus's roadblock. After a moment, the driver got out and began walking toward them. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s, wearing expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen real use. Behind him, Marcus could see other men emerging from the vehicles, some carrying metal detectors and others unloading shovels and other digging equipment. "You're blocking the road," the man called out when he was still 20 feet away. His tone was aggressive, the voice of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "This is private property," Marcus replied calmly. "You'll need to turn around and go back the way you came." The man laughed harshly. "Private property? This is open desert, buddy. We checked the maps. This whole area is public land." Marcus felt Samuel step up beside him, though the old Apache moved so quietly that the treasure hunter didn't seem to notice him at first. "The maps you consulted are incorrect," Samuel said in his deep, authoritative voice. "This area is protected under several federal laws, including the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. What you're planning to do here is a federal crime." The treasure hunter finally seemed to register Samuel's presence, and his expression shifted from aggressive confidence to something more uncertain. "Look, we're not causing any trouble. We're just looking for some old coins and maybe some jewelry. Nothing that belongs to anybody living." "Everything in these hills belongs to somebody living," Samuel replied. "It belongs to the spirits of our ancestors, and to the 7 generations yet to be born who will need these sacred places to remain undisturbed." Marcus watched the interaction carefully, noting how the treasure hunter's body language changed as more Apache men became visible on the surrounding ridges. What had started as a simple roadblock was beginning to look like something much more serious. "We have legal permits," the man said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Show them to me," Samuel demanded. The treasure hunter reached into his pocket and pulled out some folded papers. Samuel examined them briefly, then handed them back with obvious disdain. "These permits are for an area 30 miles north of here," he said. "You are trespassing on sacred ground and you will leave immediately." The standoff continued for several more minutes, with the treasure hunter growing increasingly agitated as he realized that his intended easy payday was not going to happen. Marcus kept his hand near his weapon but hoped desperately that he wouldn't need to use it. Finally, Faced with the reality of armed Apache warriors who clearly knew the law better than he did, the treasure hunter backed down. "This isn't over," he muttered as he returned to his truck. "We know there's gold up here and we're going to find it." As the three trucks turned around and headed back toward the main road, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won this confrontation, but something told him it was only the beginning of a much larger struggle. The trouble Marcus had anticipated arrived sooner than expected. 2 days after the confrontation with the treasure hunters, he received a visit from the county sheriff, a thin man named Davidson who looked uncomfortable in the desert heat despite the cool November weather. "Mr. Chen," the sheriff said, using Marcus's last name with formal politeness, "I've received some complaints about you and some other folks blocking public roads and threatening law-abiding citizens." Marcus had been expecting this. "Sheriff, I assume you're talking about the incident with the treasure hunters. They were trespassing on protected land with the intention of disturbing Native American burial sites. I was within my rights to ask them to leave." Sheriff Davidson consulted a small notebook. "According to the complaint, you and several armed Native Americans threatened to shoot them if they didn't leave public land that they had legal permits to search." "That's not accurate," Marcus replied calmly. "We asked to see their permits, which turned out to be for a completely different area 30 miles from here. No one threatened to shoot anyone. We simply informed them that they were breaking federal law." The sheriff looked genuinely torn. Marcus could see that Davidson was a decent man caught between conflicting pressures and uncertain legal ground. "Look, Mr. Chen, I don't know all the ins and outs of federal law regarding Native American sites, but I do know that blocking roads and carrying weapons during confrontations can lead to serious charges." "What would you have done if someone was about to dig up your family's cemetery?" Marcus asked. "Sometimes protecting what's sacred requires taking a stand." Before the sheriff could respond, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching. A convoy of 3 black SUVs was coming up Marcus's driveway, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a government operation. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he recognized the type of vehicles and the way they were arranged. The SUVs stopped in a precise formation, and men in dark suits began emerging from them. Their movements were coordinated and professional, and Marcus's military training immediately identified them as federal agents of some kind. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair, approached Marcus and the sheriff with confident authority. "Mr. Chen, I'm Special Agent Morrison with the Bureau of Land Management," she said, showing her credentials. "We need to speak with you about your recent activities in this area." Sheriff Davidson looked relieved to have federal authorities take over the situation. "I'll leave you folks to sort this out," he said, heading quickly back to his patrol car. Agent Morrison waited until the sheriff was gone before continuing. "Mr. Chen, we've received reports that you've been working with local Native American groups to restrict access to public lands. Some very serious allegations have been made about intimidation and threats of violence." Marcus felt his anger rising, but kept his voice level. "Agent Morrison, have you actually investigated these allegations? Have you checked the legal status of the land in question? Have you verified whether the people making these complaints actually had legal authority to be here?" "That's what we're here to determine," Morrison replied. "But first I need to understand your relationship with the local Apache community and your role in recent events." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more vehicles, this time pickup trucks carrying Jake, Samuel, and several other Apache men. Marcus felt a moment of concern, knowing how this must look to federal agents already primed to see him as a troublemaker. Samuel approached the group with his usual dignity, nodding politely to Agent Morrison. "Good morning," he said. "I am Samuel Naiche, a member of the Tribal Council. I understand there are questions about recent events in our traditional territory." Agent Morrison's demeanor shifted slightly, taking on the careful tone of someone dealing with potentially volatile political issues. "Mr. Naiche, we're investigating reports of intimidation and illegal restriction of access to public lands. Can you help us understand what happened?" Samuel's response was measured and precise. "Agent Morrison, the area in question contains burial sites and sacred locations that are protected under federal law. When we learned that treasure hunters with invalid permits were planning to desecrate these sites, we acted to prevent the destruction of irreplaceable cultural resources." "And Mr. Chen's role in this?" Morrison asked. "Mr. Chen owns property adjacent to some of our most sacred sites," Samuel explained. He has been working with us to ensure that these areas remain protected. His actions have been entirely legal and completely appropriate. For the next hour, Agent Morrison and her team interviewed Marcus, Samuel, and the other Apache men about the recent confrontation. Marcus was impressed by how thoroughly the federal agents did their job, checking legal databases on their laptops and making phone calls to verify the status of various land classifications and permit requirements. Finally, Agent Morrison closed her notebook and addressed the group. Based on our investigation, it appears that the complainants were indeed attempting to conduct archaeological excavations without proper permits on land that is protected under several federal statutes. Their permits were invalid for this location, and their planned activities would have constituted serious federal crimes. Marcus felt a wave of relief, but Morrison wasn't finished. However, she continued, this situation has brought to our attention some larger issues about land use and protection in this area. Mr. Chen, your property sits in the middle of what appears to be a significant archaeological and cultural zone. There may need to be formal designations and protections put in place to prevent future incidents. Samuel stepped forward. Agent Morrison, our people have been trying to get proper federal protection for these sites for decades. If this incident finally brings attention to the need for official designation, then something good will have come from it. After the federal agents left, Marcus sat on his porch with Samuel and Jake, watching the dust settle from the departing vehicles. The events of the morning had left him feeling drained but also strangely hopeful. What happens now? Marcus asked. Samuel considered the question carefully. Now the wheels of government bureaucracy begin to turn, he said. Agent Morrison seemed genuinely interested in protecting these sites. If we're lucky, we may finally get the federal recognition and protection that our sacred places deserve. Jake nodded, but looked concerned. The treasure hunters won't give up easily. Word is spreading on the internet about supposed Apache gold in these hills. We may face more challenges before this is over. Then we'll face them together, Marcus said. That's what guardians do. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in its familiar palette of gold and crimson, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had found his purpose in this remote place, and despite the challenges they faced, he knew he was exactly where he belonged. But even as they made plans for dealing with future threats, none of them suspected that the real test was still to come, and that Marcus would soon find himself facing a situation that would require every bit of courage and wisdom he had gained from his time as guardian of the sacred lands. The attack came at dawn on a Saturday morning in late December, just as the first pale light was beginning to touch the eastern mountains. Marcus woke to the sound that had haunted his military service in Afghanistan, the distinctive whine of multiple all-terrain vehicles approaching at high speed. His combat instincts kicked in immediately, and he rolled out of bed, grabbing his rifle and moving to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least 20 men on ATVs and dirt bikes were racing across the desert toward his property, kicking up clouds of dust that glowed pink in the early morning light. They were spread out in a loose formation that spoke of tactical planning, and many of them were carrying weapons. Marcus's satellite phone was in his hand before he was fully conscious of reaching for it. Samuel answered on the first ring, as if he too had been awakened by some internal alarm. "They're coming," Marcus said tersely. "At least 20 of them, heavily armed, moving fast from multiple directions." "We saw them," Samuel replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They bypassed the main roads and came across private ranch land to avoid detection. We're 15 minutes out, but they'll reach you before we can get there." Marcus was already moving through his house, checking weapons and ammunition while keeping watch through different windows. The attackers were closer now, close enough that he could see they were wearing military-style gear and moving with the coordination of people who had planned this assault carefully. "Don't try to be a hero," Samuel warned. "Get to the safe room and wait for us." But Marcus was no longer listening to the phone. His attention was focused on a sight that made his heart stop. Ayana's truck was coming up his driveway from the south, directly into the path of the approaching attackers. She must have left the reservation early to bring him breakfast, as she had taken to doing on weekend mornings. She had no idea what she was driving into. Without hesitation, Marcus burst out of his front door and began running toward Ayana's truck, waving his arms and shouting for her to turn around. She saw him and slowed down, confusion evident on her face. The lead group of attackers was now less than 200 yards away and closing fast. Marcus reached Ayana's truck just as the first shots rang out. The attackers weren't aiming to kill yet, but were firing warning shots designed to terrorize and control. Marcus yanked open the driver's door and practically pulled Ayana from the vehicle. "Run!" he shouted, pushing her toward the house. "Get inside and lock the doors." The next few minutes blurred together in a chaos of gunfire, shouting, and desperate movement. Marcus found himself relying on training he had hoped never to use again, moving from cover to cover while returning carefully aimed shots at the attackers. His goal wasn't to kill, but to buy time until help arrived. The attackers had clearly expected to find an isolated homesteader who would be easily intimidated or overcome. Instead, they found themselves facing someone who knew how to fight and had chosen his defensive positions well. Marcus had spent months learning every inch of his property, and he used that knowledge now to maximum advantage. From his position behind a concrete water tank, Marcus could see that the attackers were becoming frustrated and disorganized. Several of them had taken cover behind their vehicles, apparently rethinking their strategy. Their leader, the same treasure hunter who had confronted them weeks earlier, was shouting orders that his men seemed reluctant to follow. The sound Marcus had been waiting for finally reached his ears, the thunder of horses moving at full gallop. Samuel and his men appeared on the ridgeline to the north, silhouetted against the brightening sky like something from an old Western movie. But these weren't movie cowboys. They were modern Apache warriors armed with high-powered rifles and decades of experience protecting their land. The attackers found themselves caught in a crossfire they hadn't anticipated. Samuel's men had positioned themselves with military precision, using the high ground to maximum advantage. The treasure hunters suddenly realized they were facing not just an isolated homesteader, but an entire community that had been preparing for this kind of confrontation. "Federal agents," came a voice amplified by a megaphone. "Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Agent Morrison and her team had arrived, approaching from the main road with a convoy of federal vehicles. The timing couldn't have been better, as the Bureau of Land Management agents had been monitoring radio chatter about planned illegal excavations in the area. Faced with federal agents, experienced Apache fighters, and a determined veteran who knew how to use cover, the treasure hunters' assault collapsed rapidly. Most of them dropped their weapons and raised their hands, though a few tried to flee on their ATVs only to be rounded up by agents who had positioned themselves to block escape routes. As the dust settled and the last of the attackers were placed in federal custody, Marcus found himself sitting on his porch steps, trying to process what had just happened. Ayana sat beside him, both of them shaking slightly from the adrenaline of surviving a firefight. "Are you hurt?" she asked, checking him for wounds he might not have noticed in the heat of combat. "I'm okay," Marcus replied, though he knew it would take time to fully recover from the psychological impact of the attack. "Are you?" "Thanks to you," she said, and he could hear the emotion in her voice. "If you hadn't gotten me away from the truck when you did." Samuel approached, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and concern. "You fought well," he told Marcus. "You protected what was sacred even when it meant risking your own life." Agent Morrison joined them, looking grim but satisfied. "We've been tracking this group for months," she explained. "They're part of a larger network of treasure hunters who've been targeting Native American sites across the Southwest. Your actions today may have prevented them from destroying irreplaceable cultural artifacts." As the morning progressed and the various law enforcement agencies finished their work, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what had happened. The attack hadn't been a random act of greed. It had been a coordinated assault by people who viewed the sacred sites as nothing more than potential sources of profit. But the defense had been equally coordinated. Samuel revealed that the Apache community had been quietly preparing for this possibility for weeks, establishing communication networks and response protocols that had allowed them to react swiftly when the attack came. "We learned long ago that sometimes peace can only be preserved through strength," Samuel explained. "Today you proved that you understand this truth." By afternoon, the last of the federal agents had departed, and Marcus found himself alone with Ayana and her family. The events of the morning had changed something fundamental in their relationship. They had faced danger together and emerged stronger for it. "What happens now?" Marcus asked as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. "Now we continue our work as guardians," Samuel replied. Agent Morrison tells me that the federal government is finally ready to provide proper protection for our sacred sites. Your property and the surrounding area will likely be designated as a national cultural preserve within the next year. Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction at this news. His quiet desert retreat would become something much more important, a place where ancient wisdom and modern protection would work together to preserve something irreplaceable. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus stood on his porch and looked out at the desert that had become his home and his responsibility. The attack had been frightening, but it had also confirmed something he had begun to understand months ago. Some things were worth fighting for, and he had found his place among the people who understood that truth. In the hills behind his house, the sacred places rested quietly under the protection of both ancient spirits and modern guardians. The balance between worlds had been tested and had held firm, and Marcus knew that he would spend the rest of his life helping to maintain that balance. He was no longer just a man seeking solitude in the desert. He was a guardian of sacred ground, a bridge between cultures and a protector of things that could never be replaced. As Ayanna took his hand and they stood together watching the stars emerge, Marcus knew he had finally found not just a home, but a purpose that would give meaning to all his remaining days.